A single mother lived next door to me for 10 years. My own son hated her so much that he built a 10-foot solid wood fence just to block her out, telling me she was a dangerous addict who stalked our property at night. I believed him because he was my flesh and blood. But when she suddenly passed away, I was the only person who showed up to her empty funeral. That was the day her lawyer handed me a sealed letter from her. What I read inside that envelope made my blood run cold and exposed a terrifying truth about the people sleeping under my own roof. If you are listening to this right now, take a deep breath, because the nightmare I lived through could happen to anyone. To understand how I ended up standing over a grave with a letter that would send my son to prison. We have to go back 9 months earlier to the morning the chainsaws started. It was a quiet Saturday morning in our suburban Ohio neighborhood. I am 71 years old, and since my beautiful wife passed away 5 years ago, my mornings have been my sanctuary. I was sitting at my kitchen island, nursing a hot cup of black coffee, watching the early sunlight filter through the oak trees in my backyard. It was the same house I had paid off completely 15 years ago, the house where I raised my son Brian. He and his wife Megan had moved in with me a few years back. They claimed they wanted to take care of me in my old age, and as a father, I was touched. I thought I had raised a good, caring boy. Suddenly, a deafening roar shattered the morning silence. It was the harsh, aggressive grinding of heavy machinery and chainsaws coming from right outside my kitchen window. I startled so hard I spilled hot coffee over my hand. I set the mug down and hurried to the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. When I stepped out onto the patio, I could not believe my eyes. A crew of 4 men in hard hats and neon vests was tearing up the property line between my yard and the house next door. They were digging massive trenches and sinking thick, heavy wooden posts deep into the ground. Standing right in the middle of the chaos, wearing a crisp designer polo shirt and holding a clipboard, was my son Brian. I walked down the patio steps, the smell of fresh sawdust and torn earth burning my nose. I worked as a municipal building inspector for 30 years. I know every zoning law, every property code, and every residential permit requirement in this county by heart. I looked at the sheer size of the posts they were burying. They were easily 12 feet long, meant to support a solid wood barrier, at least 10 feet high. In this area, anything over 6 feet requires a special permit, a structural review, and usually a neighborhood hearing. You cannot simply build a fortress wall between 2 suburban properties. I waved my arms to get his attention over the screaming chainsaws. Brian saw me and signaled the crew to cut the engines. The sudden quiet rang in my ears. "What in the world is going on here?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of confusion and anger. "You are putting up a 10-foot privacy fence without consulting me." "This is my house, Brian. And beyond that, this is completely illegal. You do not have a permit for a structure this high. The city will fine us and tear it down." Brian let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He walked over to me, putting a heavy hand on my shoulder. He looked me right in the eye, his face twisting into an expression of deep concern. "Dad, please calm down," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "I know about the zoning laws. I have lawyers handling the permits right now. I had to rush this because we have a serious emergency on our hands." "An emergency," I repeated, looking past him to the house next door. It was a modest, well-kept home. Sarah lived there. She was a quiet, polite single mother of 38, raising a sweet 10-year-old boy named Leo. Whenever I was in the front yard, she would wave and smile. I had never seen a single troubling thing happen on her property. "Yes, an emergency," Brian insisted, lowering his voice as if someone might overhear us. "Dad, you do not see what goes on around here at night because you go to sleep early. That woman next door, Sarah, she is not who you think she is. She is completely unhinged." I frowned, shaking my head. "Sarah, she seems like a perfectly nice mother. She works long hours." Brian scoffed a bitter sound that surprised me. "That is a front, Dad. She is a heavy addict. I did not want to worry you, but she has been creeping around our backyard in the middle of the night. Last week I caught her looking through our basement windows. She was twitching, talking to herself. She is dangerous, Dad. She is unpredictable. I am building this fence to protect you. I am protecting our property. I stood there in the damp morning grass, processing his words. I looked at the deep trenches tearing through my beautiful lawn. Then I looked at my son. His eyes were wide, pleading with me to believe him. He was a successful real estate manager. He wore expensive suits, drove a luxury car, and had always presented himself as a pillar of the community. Why would he lie to me about something so specific? If she is trespassing and on drugs, we need to call the police, I said firmly. We do not build an illegal 10-foot barricade. We cannot call the cops, Brian shot back quickly, almost too quickly. He tightened his grip on my shoulder. If we call the police, she will know it was us. Addicts are vindictive, Dad. What if she retaliates? What if I am at work and she tries to break in while you are here alone? No. A high fence is the safest, quietest way to deal with this. Just let me handle it. I am taking care of you, just like I promised I would. The words sounded noble, but a faint, uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. My gut, honed by decades of dealing with lying contractors and corner-cutting builders, whispered that something was out of place. The sheer height of the fence, the panic in his eyes. It felt like an extreme reaction to a neighborhood nuisance. But I pushed the doubt down. This was my boy. He had given up his privacy to live with me after his mother died. He was the only family I had left. I nodded slowly, taking a step back. All right, I muttered. But if the city comes knocking, you are the one paying the fines. Brian smiled, a bright, relieved expression washing over his face. He patted my back and turned around, signaling the men to start the chainsaws again. I walked back into my house, the roaring noise resuming louder and more violently than before. Over the next 2 days, the massive wooden wall went up, sealing off the entire eastern side of my property. It blocked the morning sun. It cast a long, cold shadow over my kitchen windows. My home no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a fortress. Or worse, it felt like a cage. I convinced myself it was for the best. I convinced myself that Brian was just a protective son. I had no idea that the fence had nothing to do with keeping Sarah out. He built it to keep me trapped inside and to hide the monstrous things he was doing under the cover of darkness. If you are enjoying my story so far, please leave a like and subscribe so you do not miss the rest of this journey, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. 9 months went by. For 9 long months I lived behind that towering wooden barricade. I never saw Sarah wave from her driveway again. I never heard young Leo laughing in their backyard. My home, once bright and open, felt suffocated by the shadow of that fence. Brian and Megan carried on with their lives, attending their upscale dinners and buying new designer clothes, acting as if everything was perfectly normal. I tried to focus on my garden, trying to ignore the creeping sense of isolation. Then, on a cold Tuesday afternoon in November, the news swept through our quiet street. Sarah was dead. It was a single car crash on the old highway just outside of town. The authorities said her vehicle had swerved off the road late at night and struck an embankment. She died instantly. When I heard the news from the local mail carrier, a profound sadness washed over me. Regardless of what Brian had told me about her alleged addiction, she was still a mother. She left behind a 10-year-old boy who was now entirely alone in the world. I knew immediately that I had to pay my respects. I walked back into the house, finding Brian and Megan in the living room. They were sipping sparkling water and watching television. I cleared my throat and told them about the tragic accident. I told them I would be attending her funeral service on Friday morning. I expected them to show at least a fraction of human decency. Instead, the room went dead silent. Brian slowly lowered his glass to the coffee table. He stood up, his face flushed with an ugly sudden anger that took me completely by surprise. "Are you out of your mind, Dad?" he snapped, his voice echoing sharply off the walls. "You are not going to that woman's funeral. It is a complete waste of time." I stared at him, taken aback by his hostility. A waste of time. I echoed, my voice steady but thick with disbelief. A young mother just lost her life, Brian. A boy lost his mother. It is the decent thing to do. Megan stood up then, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Her eyes were hard, devoid of any sympathy. Brian is right, Richard, she said coldly. Why would you go to the funeral of a drug addict who stalked our property? You did not even know her. People will talk. It will make us look terrible if you show up there. I looked back and forth between the two of them. My own flesh and blood and the woman he chose to marry. They were practically vibrating with anxiety and rage. Why did they care so much? If Sarah was truly just a neighborhood nuisance, her death should have brought them a grim sense of relief or at least polite indifference. But this was panic. This was a desperate, aggressive attempt to control my movements. Brian stepped closer, towering over me. I forbid it, he said, his tone dripping with disrespect. You are staying right here. I am not having you embarrass this family. My heart pounded against my ribs. For the first time in my life, I looked at my son and saw a stranger. A cold, callous stranger. I did not raise you to be this cruel, I whispered. I turned my back on them and walked straight to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I did not argue further. I did not need to. My gut was screaming at me. Their extreme reaction was the final crack in the illusion I had been living in. They were hiding something, and I was going to find out what it was. When Friday morning arrived, I woke up before dawn. I put on my best black suit, the same one I wore to my own wife's funeral. I polished my shoes in the quiet of my room. I could hear Brian and Megan moving around in the kitchen upstairs, likely waiting to intercept me. I did not give them the chance. I slipped out through the side door, got into my old truck, and drove away before they even knew I was gone. The drive to the cemetery was gray and bitterly cold. The sky was a heavy blanket of overcast clouds threatening rain. As I drove, my mind raced. I thought about the towering fence. I thought about the supposed late-night stalking. Nothing made sense anymore. I gripped the steering wheel tight, determined to pay my respects to a lost soul and perhaps find some clarity. I followed the directions printed in the small local obituary. The cemetery was located on a quiet rolling hill on the outskirts of the county. As I pulled through the wrought iron gates, I expected to see a crowd. I expected to see distant relatives, co-workers, or maybe friends from rehab if Brian's story had any truth to it. But as I parked my truck and walked over the frosty grass toward the burial plot, my breath caught in my throat. The scene before me was chillingly empty. There was no crowd. There were no murmuring friends or weeping relatives. There was only the open earth, a simple wooden casket, and the quiet rustle of the wind through the bare trees. Standing beside the grave was young Leo. He looked so small, drowning in an oversized black coat, his head bowed as he stared at the ground. Standing next to him, resting a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, was a tall man wearing a sharp tailored gray suit. The man was a stranger to me. That was it. Out of the entire world, I was the third person to arrive. I walked up to the graveside, the dry leaves crunching beneath my polished shoes. The man in the suit turned his head and looked at me. His expression was impossible to read, a mix of grim calculation and deep sorrow. The wind picked up across the open cemetery, biting at my face and cutting through my dark wool coat. The man gently patted the young boy on the back, murmuring something soft and comforting into the chilled air before stepping away from the freshly dug grave. He walked slowly toward me, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft, frost-covered earth. He stopped just a few feet away, studying my face for a long, silent moment before extending a gloved hand. "You must be Richard Gibson," he said. His voice was deep and measured, carrying easily over the whistling wind. I took his hand, offering a firm, polite shake. I replied, my voice raspy from the biting cold. "But everyone just calls me Rick. I live next door to them. Or rather, I used to be her neighbor." The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I know exactly who you are, Rick. My name is Thomas Keller. I am Sarah's attorney, or I suppose the executor of her estate now. Thomas reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a thick, cream-colored envelope. It looked heavy, formal, and completely out of place in this bleak, lonely place. Sarah told me that if anything ever happened to her, and if you were the absolutely only person from your household to attend her funeral, I was to give this directly to you. Only to you. I stared at the envelope. My first name was written across the front in elegant, looping handwriting. Sarah's handwriting. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached out and took the letter. It felt freezing cold against my bare skin. What is it? I asked, my throat suddenly going dry. I do not know the exact contents, Thomas replied quietly, adjusting his dark tie. But she made it explicitly clear that it was a matter of life and death. She said you would need it to understand what is truly happening inside your own home. He gave me one last, deeply meaningful look. Be careful, Rick. With that final warning, he turned around and walked back to comfort young Leo, leaving me standing completely alone with a ghost's final words resting heavily in my open palm. I could not bring myself to open it right there, standing under the heavy gray sky. I walked to the edge of the burial plot, paid my final respects, whispered a quiet prayer for Sarah and her orphaned boy, and then turned away from the tragic scene. The long walk back to my parked truck felt like walking through thick, pulling mud. Every single step was heavy with building dread. My mind aggressively raced back to Brian's volatile behavior that very morning, his desperate and angry attempts to keep me away from this exact place. What was he so deeply afraid of me finding out? I climbed into the cold cab of my old truck, slamming the heavy door shut and successfully blocking out the biting autumn wind. I did not reach for the keys to start the engine. The silence inside the dark cabin was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic sound of my own ragged breathing. I stared at the sealed envelope for a very long time. The paper felt thick and expensive between my rough fingers. I slowly slid my thumb under the edge of the flap, breaking the red wax seal. Inside was a single, tightly folded sheet of paper. I carefully unfolded it, reaching up to turn on the overhead cabin light to better read the blue ink. The handwriting inside was rushed, frantic, and completely different from the elegant script on the outer envelope. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as I began to read the final message. Dear Rick, the letter abruptly began. If you are reading this right now, it means I am gone and you are standing at a terrifying crossroads. I do not have much time, but you desperately need to know the truth. I know your son told you I was a dangerous person. I know he aggressively painted me as an unstable addict who stalked your property late at night. None of that was true. I was never stalking your house. I was looking for my son's cat, a small orange tabby that had wandered into your thick bushes. But what I saw your son doing in your backyard that specific night terrified me to my absolute core. Rick Bryan did not build that massive wooden fence to keep me out. He built it to keep you locked in. He built it to permanently hide his dark tracks from the street view and to completely isolate you from the rest of the outside world. You are in terrible, imminent danger, and the real threat is sleeping soundly under your own roof. Do not ask him about this letter. Do not ever show him this warning. If you want to know the terrifying truth about what he is secretly doing to you, you need to look much closer. Check the false bottom of your basement electrical sub-panel. You know the exact one. The old gray metal box located near the furnace. Pry up the metal floor of that box. The horrifying answers are waiting for you down there. Please protect yourself. Sarah. I folded the paper, tucking it into my pocket. My hands were shaking violently. If you want to know what a father finds when he searches his own basement in the dead of night, hit the like button and subscribe right now. Let me know in the comments below if you have ever been betrayed by someone you loved deeply. Keep listening closely, because the dark, twisted nightmare surrounding my supposedly perfect family was only just beginning to truly unfold for me that cold afternoon. I drove back to my house with a cold knot tightening in my chest. When I pulled into the driveway, the sky had already turned pitch black. Inside the house was warm and smelled of roasted chicken. Brian and Megan were sitting at the dining table laughing over a glass of red wine, acting as if the morning's explosive argument had never happened. I played my part carefully. I told them I was exhausted from the cold weather and just wanted to go to sleep early. Brian smiled a wide, genuine-looking smile and told me to rest well. I walked into my bedroom, shut the door, and turned off the light. I did not get into bed. Instead, I sat perfectly still in the dark armchair by the window, listening. I had to wait until the house was completely asleep. The hours dragged on each minute, feeling like a heavy stone. I heard the clinking of dishes being washed, the murmur of the television turning on, and eventually the heavy footsteps of my son and his wife heading upstairs to the master bedroom. I waited another 2 hours after the floorboards stopped creaking. When the digital clock on my nightstand flashed 2 in the morning, I finally stood up. I took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing nerves before moving toward the heavy oak door. My heart beat like a war drum against my ribs as I slowly opened my bedroom door. The hallway was completely dark and silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I slipped out of my room in my socks, avoiding the 3rd and 5th steps on the staircase that I knew always squeaked. Every shadow seemed to stretch and reach for me. I made my way to the basement door, holding my breath as I turned the brass knob. It clicked softly, a sound that felt deafening in the dead of night. I stepped onto the wooden stairs descending into the basement. The air down here was cooler, smelling faintly of dust and old concrete. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. Instead, I pulled a small, heavy-duty flashlight from my pocket, clicking it on to cast a narrow beam across the unfinished floor. I navigated past stacks of old cardboard boxes and my woodworking tools, moving directly toward the utility wall. There, tucked between the water heater and the main furnace, was the old gray metal electrical sub-panel Sarah had mentioned in her letter. I had inspected thousands of these boxes over my 30-year career. I knew exactly how they were built, how they were mounted, and where the blind spots were. I approached the metal panel, running the beam of my flashlight over its dusty surface. From a quick glance, it looked perfectly normal. But when I knelt down and shone the light underneath the box, my breath hitched. There were fresh scratches on the bottom edge of the metal casing. Someone had been opening it recently and frequently. I set my flashlight down on a nearby ledge, angling it so I could see what I was doing. Using my pocket knife, I carefully wedged the blade into the small seam at the base of the panel. I pried downward. With a soft metallic scrape, the false bottom swung open. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably as a thick, heavy stack of papers slid out from the hidden compartment and landed with a soft thud on the cold concrete floor. I dropped to my knees, picking up the bundle. It was held together by a thick rubber band. I slipped the rubber band off and turned the flashlight directly onto the top sheet of paper. It was a letter from the county tax assessor's office addressed directly to me. Across the top, stamped in bold red ink, were the words, "Final Notice of Delinquency." My eyes scanned the page in absolute horror. It stated that my property taxes had not been paid in over 2 years. The total amount owed was staggering, and the letter explicitly warned of an impending public auction of my property. I quickly flipped to the next envelope. It was another official notice, this time from a collection agency. Then another and another. My mind spun in dizzying circles. I had paid off this house completely 15 years ago. Since I retired, Brian had insisted on taking over the physical task of sorting the mail and paying the monthly utility bills from my pension account. He told me it was the least he could do to help his aging father. He had intercepted every single piece of important financial correspondence. He had systematically hidden the truth from me while living comfortably under my roof. But the worst was yet to come. Near the bottom of the stack, I found a thick, professionally bound legal document. The logo on the front belonged to a major national bank. I opened the heavy cover and read the title page. It was a home equity line of credit agreement. The total loan amount was $1.5 million. My stomach violently dropped. Someone had taken out a massive life-destroying loan against the equity of my fully paid-off home. I aggressively flipped to the last page, my hands shaking so hard I could barely focus the flashlight beam. There on the borrower signature line was my name, Richard Gibson. But it was not my handwriting. It was a masterful, meticulously practiced forgery. The strokes were confident and smooth, mimicking my signature with terrifying precision. I stared at the forged ink, the cold dampness of the basement seeping into my bones. My own son had not just lied to me, he had financially gutted me. He had stolen my past, my present, and my future, chaining me to a mountain of debt I could never repay in my lifetime. I sat alone in the dark, clutching the stolen papers. The cold concrete of the basement floor seeped through my clothes, but the chill in my heart was far worse. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I stayed down there for hours, reading every single notice, tallying the massive numbers in my head. $1.5 million. It was a truly staggering sum of money that I could scarcely begin to comprehend. I thought about the long, exhausting decades I spent climbing into sweltering hot attics and crawling under damp, muddy foundations just to pay off this beautiful house. I did it for my family. I did it for him. And he had simply wiped it all away with a single stroke of a pen. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the small basement window, I slowly gathered the papers. I chose the most recent foreclosure warning and the signature page of the loan agreement. The rest I carefully returned to the hidden compartment beneath the electrical panel. I walked upstairs, my joints aching, my mind strangely calm. It was not the calm of peace. It was the terrifying calm that comes right before a devastating storm. I went to the bathroom, washed my tired face, and waited. By 8 in the morning, the familiar sounds of morning filled the house. I heard the expensive espresso machine whirring in the kitchen. I heard Megan humming softly as she moved about. I walked down the hallway, the heavy papers gripped tightly in my right hand. When I stepped into the kitchen, the scene looked just like a picture out of a luxury magazine. Brian was standing by the marble island, wearing a freshly pressed suit, casually sipping his dark espresso. Megan sat on a stool, flipping through a glossy catalog, her wrist adorned with a thick gold bracelet that I now knew was paid for with my stolen equity. They looked up when I entered. "Good morning, Dad," Brian said cheerfully, setting his small cup down. "Did you sleep well?" I did not answer him. I walked straight up to the kitchen island. I did not yell. I did not scream. I simply raised my arm and slammed the county foreclosure threat and the forged bank document down onto the pristine marble surface. The loud smack echoed sharply off the kitchen walls, making Megan physically jump in her seat. Brian looked down at the papers. For a split second, the room was suspended in absolute breathless silence. Then I watched the arrogant color completely drain from my son's face. He turned a sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted from the red ink of the foreclosure notice to my cold, unblinking stare. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls were closing in on us. "Brian," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady, "tell me exactly what I am looking at." For a moment he tried to play dumb. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands began to shake, rattling his espresso cup against the marble counter. Then the performance began. Brian crumpled. His shoulders heaved and he buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. He dropped to his knees right there on the kitchen floor, clutching at the hem of my shirt. "Dad, I am so sorry," he wept, tears streaming down his face. "Please, you have to understand. The real estate firm is completely going under. We lost 3 major commercial accounts this year. The partners were going to file for bankruptcy, and they were going to hold me personally liable. I was desperate. I was so terrified of losing everything, of ruining the family name. I did not know what else to do. I forged your signature on that equity line because I thought I could flip a commercial property and pay it all back before you ever found out. It was a moment of pure weakness. I swear to you, I only did it to save us. I stood there looking down at the man I had raised. He sounded so genuinely broken. He sounded like a terrified little boy who had made a terrible mistake. Before I could say another word, Megan rushed around the kitchen island. She threw herself onto the floor next to Brian, tears spilling over her perfectly applied makeup. She grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. "Richard, please listen to him," she begged, her voice trembling with emotion. "It has been a living nightmare for us. Brian has not been sleeping. He has been sick with guilt every single day. We never meant to hurt you. We just wanted to protect you from the stress of the business failing. Please, I am begging you, do not call the police. If you report the forgery, he will go to federal prison. His life will be completely over. We have a buyer lined up for a massive property downtown. The deal closes next month. As soon as the money clears, we will pay off the entire bank loan. We will cover the back taxes. We will fix everything, I swear it on my life. Just give us 1 month to make this right." I looked at the two of them, kneeling on the floor of the house they had stolen from me, crying tears that looked so incredibly real. Any normal father would have felt a surge of protective instinct. Any normal father would have embraced his son and promised to help him fix the mess. But as I listened to their desperate apologies, I felt absolutely nothing. Sarah's warning echoed loudly in my mind. "He built the fence to keep you locked in." My gut twisted sharply. The story they were telling me was perfectly constructed. It made logical sense. But I knew deep down in my aging bones that every single word spilling from their lying mouths was just a carefully rehearsed lie. I looked down at the two of them kneeling on my kitchen floor. Their faces were buried in their hands, their shoulders shaking with devastating sorrow. If I had not read Sarah's letter, if I had not seen the cold calculation in Brian's eyes, I would have fallen for it completely. I took a deep breath, forcing my racing heart to slow down. I needed to play this perfectly. I let out a sigh. I reached out and rested a trembling hand on Brian's shoulder. "Get up," I said softly, my voice carrying the perfect mixture of exhaustion and disappointment. "Just get up off the floor." Brian slowly raised his head, his eyes red and puffy. He looked at me like a beaten dog waiting for a final blow. I looked away from him, staring at the marble countertop. "You have exactly 60 days, I told them, my tone weary. 60 days to close this supposed real estate deal and pay off every single penny of this massive debt. You will clear the back taxes and remove my name from that forged bank loan completely. If this is not entirely resolved in 2 months, I will walk straight into the police precinct and hand them these documents myself. Do you understand me?" Brian scrambled to his feet vigorously, nodding his head. "Yes, Dad," he gasped, wiping his face. "I promise you, you will not regret this." Megan stood up beside him, exhaling a breath so loud it sounded like a punctured tire. She moved to hug me, but I took a deliberate step backward, holding my hand up. "Do not," I warned her quietly. "Just give me some space." I walked over to the kitchen sink and gripped the cold metal edge, closing my eyes tightly. I pressed my right hand hard against my chest, right over my heart, and began to take short, shallow breaths. Brian noticed immediately. "Dad," he asked, his voice suddenly sharp with a new kind of panic. "Are you okay? Is it your heart?" I kept my eyes closed, nodding slowly. "The stress of this is too much for me," I whispered, letting my voice crack just enough to sound vulnerable. "I cannot be in this house right now. I cannot look at either of you without feeling physically ill. My blood pressure is through the roof, and I feel like I am going to collapse. I need to get away from here before this actually kills me." Megan exchanged a quick, nervous glance with Brian. "Where will you go?" she asked tentatively. I turned to face them, looking as frail and defeated as I possibly could. I am going to call my old buddy down in Florida, I said. He has a small fishing cabin right on the coast. I am going to pack a bag, drive down there, and stay off the grid for the next 2 weeks. I need the ocean air. I need quiet. And I need to not think about the fact that my own son forged my signature to steal my home. Brian opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off sharply. Do not argue with me, I snapped. Just let me pack my things and leave. If you truly want to make this right, you will spend the next 2 weeks fixing this catastrophic mess instead of worrying about me. Brian swallowed hard and nodded, stepping back to give me a wide berth. I walked past them, my heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway as I headed toward my bedroom to pack my bags. I pulled a dusty canvas duffel bag from the closet and began throwing clothes into it. I packed a few heavy sweaters, some jeans, and my sturdy boots. I also packed the forged bank documents, the tax notices, and the sealed envelope containing Sarah's letter. I zipped the bag shut, hoisted it over my shoulder, and walked back out to the living room. Brian and Megan were standing by the front door, looking like two reprimanded children. I did not say a word to them. I simply walked out the front door, climbed into my truck, and started the engine. I backed out of the driveway, ignoring them as they stood on the porch watching me leave. I drove south for about 20 miles, sticking to the main highway, so they would think I was heading toward the interstate. But as soon as I was sure no one was following me, I took a sharp exit and turned my truck around. I did not drive to Florida. I did not even leave the state. I drove exactly 2 towns over to a forgotten industrial district bordered by an old railway line. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the cheapest, most rundown motel I could find. The neon sign out front was buzzing loudly, half of its red letters burned out. I walked into the dingy lobby, paid for 2 weeks, and used a fake last name. The clerk handed me a heavy brass key without even looking up from his phone. I found my room at the very end of the second-floor walkway. It smelled like stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine cleaner, but it was absolutely perfect. I locked the wooden door behind me, slid the chain into place, and closed the dusty blinds tightly. I tossed my bag onto the lumpy mattress and pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket. I powered the device off, removing the battery and tossing it onto the bedside table. I was officially off the grid. No one in the world knew where I was. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning loudly beneath my weight, and let out a long, shaky breath. The act was over. The father was gone. Now it was just me alone in the dark, preparing to hunt down the terrifying truth about the monsters living inside my house. The next morning I woke up before the sun even considered rising over the industrial skyline. The cheap motel mattress had done my aching back no favors, but I did not care. My mind was sharp-focused entirely on the grim task ahead. I walked to the front office, bought a stale cup of black coffee from a vending machine, and asked the clerk where the nearest electronics store was. I needed a burner phone. By 8 in the morning, I sat in the cab of my truck, holding a cheap, prepaid cell phone. I pulled the letter from my jacket pocket. At the bottom of the page, beneath her frantic warning, was a phone number for Thomas Keller, her attorney. I punched the digits into the small plastic phone and waited as it rang. Thomas answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional. When I told him who I was and where I was calling from, the professional tone vanished, replaced by a heavy urgency. He told me to come to his office immediately. He gave me an address downtown, far away from the suburbs and prying eyes. The drive into the city felt like a blur. My thoughts were consumed by the forged signature, the mountain of debt, and the image of my son crying fake tears on my kitchen floor. I parked my truck in a gray concrete parking garage and walked 2 blocks to a tall, imposing glass building. His private law office was on the 14th floor. When the elevator doors slid open, I stepped into a quiet, understated reception area. A receptionist immediately ushered me down a long corridor lined with thick mahogany doors. Thomas was waiting for me inside his private office. He closed the heavy door behind us and locked it with a solid click. He gestured for me to sit in a leather chair across from his wide desk. He did not offer me coffee or make polite small talk. He simply sat down, folded his hands together, and looked at me with a profound sadness that made my stomach churn all over again. "You found the documents," Thomas said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. I nodded slowly, pulling the folded foreclosure notice and the forged loan agreement from my jacket. I placed them flat on his polished wooden desk. "My son stole $1.5 million using my home as collateral," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He intercepted my mail. He forged my name. He lied to my face." I looked up at Thomas, my chest tight. Sarah tried to warn me. But how did she know? How did a single mother next door know about the secret compartment in my basement? Why did she care? Thomas let out a long, heavy breath. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder, placing it gently on top of my forged documents. "Rick," he said quietly, "you need to understand something very important. Sarah Jenkins was not just a neighborhood mother, and she certainly was not a drug addict. That was a vicious lie designed to completely discredit her in case you ever started asking questions." I frowned, leaning forward in my chair. Then who was she? She was a highly specialized investigative paralegal. Thomas explained, his eyes never leaving mine. She worked for a private financial intelligence firm. Her entire career was built on tracking down corporate embezzlement, money laundering, and complex financial fraud. For the last 2 years, she was the lead investigator on a massive, highly classified case involving a string of corrupt real estate developers in this state. My heart skipped a painful beat. "The firm of Brian." Thomas nodded grimly. "Yes. His firm. They were not just losing commercial accounts, Rick. They were systematically laundering millions of dollars through phantom properties and shell corporations. Sarah had been tracking their dirty money for months. But Brian and his partners were incredibly careful. They hid their digital tracks well. Sarah knew she needed physical evidence. She needed to get close to the inner circle. I stared at him, the pieces of the puzzle violently snapping together in my mind. "She moved next door on purpose," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "Exactly," Thomas said. "When the house next to yours went on the market 10 months ago, her firm quietly purchased it under a blind trust. She moved in with her son to establish a cover. She knew Brian was living with you. She knew he brought his work home. She was monitoring him. But what started as a corporate fraud investigation quickly turned into something much darker when she realized what he was doing to his own father. She saw the mail being diverted. She observed the late-night meetings on your patio. She realized Brian was not just stealing from his wealthy clients. He was draining your life savings to fund his criminal enterprise and protect his own assets." A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. "He called her dangerous," I murmured, remembering the panic in his voice the morning the chainsaws started. "He said she was stalking us." "Because she was getting too close," Thomas replied sharply. "She found something damning, something that could put Brian and his partners in federal prison for decades. They realized she was watching them. That is why your son built that massive 10-foot fence. It was not just to block her view. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to sever her line of sight and isolate you entirely, so he could finish draining your estate before she could intervene." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. He slowly set it down on the wooden desk. "She secretly mailed this directly to me the day before her fatal crash," he said. "You need to see what is on it." I reached out and picked up the small silver flash drive from the polished mahogany desk. It weighed practically nothing in my palm, yet it felt heavier than a block of solid lead. I slipped it into my jacket pocket, thanking Thomas for his time and his absolute discretion. He offered to let me use one of the secure computers in his firm, but I politely declined. I needed to do this alone. I needed to see whatever was on that drive without anyone else watching heart break into a million irreparable pieces. I walked out of the towering glass building, and stepped back into the freezing city air. My mind was buzzing with a chaotic swarm of thoughts. Everything I thought I knew about my quiet suburban life, my son, and the tragically deceased single mother next door had been violently turned upside down. I drove away from the downtown financial district, navigating the maze of crowded city streets, until I found a dusty pawn shop tucked between a liquor store and a vacant lot. I parked my truck and went inside. The shop smelled like old metal and despair. I walked straight to the electronics counter and pointed at a thick, outdated black laptop sitting under the glass case. I did not care about the brand or how fast it was. I just needed a functioning screen and a USB port. I paid the man behind the counter $150 in crisp cash, refusing the receipt. I tucked the laptop under my arm and hurried back to my truck. The drive back to my dreary motel room felt agonizingly slow. Every red light felt like a personal insult, delaying the inevitable moment of truth. When I finally returned to the motel, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the cracked asphalt parking lot. I unlocked the heavy wooden door of my room, stepped inside, and threw the deadbolt. The room was perfectly still, smelling faintly of the cheap pine cleaner from the morning. I walked over to the small, rickety wooden desk, pushed up against the far wall, and sat down in the squeaky vinyl chair. I placed the thick black laptop on the desk, plugged the frayed power cord into a nearby wall outlet, and pressed the power button. The machine whirred to life with a loud mechanical hum, the screen glowing a harsh, bright blue that illuminated the dark, dingy room. I took a deep, steadying breath, reached into my pocket, and pulled out the silver flash drive. My hands were shaking again. I gripped my right wrist with my left hand, forcing the trembling to stop, and firmly inserted the drive into the side of the computer. A small window popped up on the screen, indicating the device had been recognized. I used the worn trackpad to open the main folder. Inside, I found a meticulously organized directory. Sarah had been a true professional. The folders were neatly labeled by month, then by week, and finally by specific dates. My eyes scanned the titles. There were documents, scanned bank records, and PDF files, but my attention was immediately drawn to a folder labeled simply as Surveillance Media. I double-clicked the folder, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Dozens of video files populated the screen. Each file was titled with a date and a timestamp. I clicked on a text document titled Camera Setup Notes, hoping for some context. Sarah had documented everything. Reading her brief notes, I learned exactly how she had managed to watch my home. On her side of the property, towering over the dividing line, was a massive ancient oak tree. Its thick branches extended high into the sky, easily clearing the height of the illegal 10-foot wooden fence Brian had built. Deep within the thick canopy of leaves, completely hidden from the ground level, Sarah had installed a high-definition motion-activated trail camera. It was the kind of equipment used by hunters to track wildlife in the pitch black of night. She had angled the lens perfectly downward, giving her an unobstructed, clear aerial view directly into my backyard and right onto my rear patio. She had an eye in the sky, silently recording everything my son did when he thought the rest of the world was fast asleep. I closed the text document and went back to the list of video files. The sheer volume of recordings made my stomach churn. How long had they been using my patio to plot their crimes? And I scrolled down the long list looking for a starting point. My eyes locked onto a specific file name. The timestamp was dated exactly 2 nights before the deafening chainsaws had ruined my Saturday morning. 2 nights before, Brian had aggressively claimed Sarah was a dangerous addict who was stalking our property. This was the exact footage she had mentioned in her final letter. The footage that had terrified her so deeply that she felt compelled to reach out to me from beyond the grave. I moved the cursor over the file. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I knew that once I clicked play, there would be absolutely no going back. The last shred of the relationship I had cherished for 42 years would be completely destroyed. I swallowed the thick lump forming in my throat and double-clicked the video file. The media player expanded to fill the entire laptop screen. At first, the video was completely pitch black. Then the night vision sensors adjusted, rendering the scene in a ghostly monochrome green. I immediately recognized the familiar layout of my own backyard. I clearly saw my manicured lawn and the stone pavers of my rear patio. The camera angle looked straight down at the patio table. The dark night was still until the motion sensor triggered. The heavy wooden back door slowly pushed wide open. Brian stepped onto the stone pavers holding 2 crystal wine glasses. Megan followed carrying an expensive red wine I recognized. It was a vintage bottle I saved for a special occasion. She wore a silk robe, her hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. Sarah's trail camera microphone was incredibly sensitive. I heard the wind through the oak branches, the distant traffic, and the crisp sound of wine splashing as Brian poured. They sat down together on the cushioned wicker sofa I had assembled last spring. They looked so relaxed. They looked like a successful couple enjoying a peaceful evening at their private estate. Watching them lounge on my furniture, drinking my wine while I sat shivering in a cheap motel room, made a hot wave of nausea wash over me. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes fixed on my son's face. Megan took a slow sip, sighing heavily as she leaned back against the cushions. She stared at the dark sky before turning to Brian. "I am unbelievably sick of this," she said, her voice dripping with irritation. "I cannot stand walking on eggshells in here anymore. Every morning I have to paste on a fake smile and pretend I care about what he wants for breakfast. How much longer do we have to live with the clueless old man?" The word struck me like a physical blow. The clueless old man. That was how she saw me. Not as a father who welcomed her into his home, not as a benefactor providing them with a free place to live. I was just a clueless old man, an annoying obstacle. I waited for Brian to defend me. I waited for the boy I raised to show a single ounce of loyalty, to tell his wife to show some respect. Instead, Brian let out an amused chuckle. He gently stroked her arm, smiling, as if she had just told a clever joke. "Just be patient, honey," Brian said smoothly, his voice devoid of any guilt. "The hard part is almost over. We have already secured the main bag. You just have to play the devoted daughter-in-law for a little bit longer until everything is finalized." Megan rolled her eyes, taking another large gulp of wine. "I know," she muttered impatiently, "but it is exhausting. And my mother keeps calling me every single day asking when the renovations are going to be completely finished. She wants to pick out custom drapery for the formal dining room, and she is complaining about the contractor you hired." Brian let out a frustrated sigh, setting his glass down on the patio table. "Tell your mother to stop complaining," he snapped, a sharp edge creeping into his calm voice. "She is getting a 6-bedroom luxury estate in the most exclusive neighborhood in the county for absolutely nothing. I funneled $1.5 million out of my father's equity to buy that mansion in her and your father's name. They get to live like absolute royalty, completely mortgage-free, and the property cannot be traced back to my accounts if the firm gets audited. The least your mother can do is be patient with the tile installation." I hit the spacebar, pausing the video instantly. The image on the screen froze, locking Brian in a scowl, and Megan with a glass raised to her lips. I sat back in the squeaky vinyl chair, the air completely rushing out of my lungs. The room began to spin. My hands gripped the edges of the rickety wooden desk so hard, my knuckles turned stark white. The story Brian had tearfully fed me on the kitchen floor about his real estate firm going bankrupt, the desperate need to save the family name from financial ruin. It was all an elaborate, meticulously rehearsed lie. Every single tear he shed was fabricated. He had not stolen my life savings to rescue himself from a professional disaster. He had drained the equity of my fully paid-off home to secretly purchase a massive luxury mansion. And he deliberately put the deed to that extravagant property under the names of Megan's parents. They were taking the blood, sweat, and tears of my 30-year career and handing it over to her family. They were systematically bleeding me completely dry. They were using my own home as a limitless piggy bank to elevate her parents into the upper echelon of high society while plotting to leave me drowning in an ocean of forged debt. The absolute cruelty of it was paralyzing. I stared at the frozen screen tracing the contours of my son's face in the eerie green light. He sold my future so his mother-in-law could complain about custom drapery and expensive tile contractors. I felt a sharp, agonizing pain in my chest, a deep ache that made it incredibly difficult to draw a full breath. I had spent decades teaching him the supreme value of an honest day of hard work. I had sacrificed my own comfort to ensure he went to a prestigious college without student loans. I opened the doors of my sanctuary to him and his wife when they claimed they wanted to care for me, and this was my reward. To be openly mocked on my own patio, stripped of my security, and treated like an ignorant fool. I slowly pressed the spacebar again, forcing myself to watch the rest of the agonizing footage. I needed to hear every single word. I needed to absorb every drop of their toxic betrayal, because the sorrow in my heart was rapidly transforming. The shock was burning away, leaving behind a cold, calculating, and unforgiving fury. They thought I was just a clueless old man who would quietly fade away into the shadows. They had absolutely no idea what an angry inspector could do when he stopped looking at blueprints and started looking for revenge. I kept my finger pressed against the edge of the cheap plastic trackpad and watched the video resume its steady playback. The eerie green glow of the night vision cast deep shadows across my patio, illuminating the terrifying monsters I had unknowingly welcomed into my sanctuary. Megan shifted her weight on the wicker sofa. She looked at Brian with a mixture of annoyance and nervous anticipation. "But what if he notices something before the house is finished?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "What if he accidentally answers the front door when a debt collector comes knocking, or figures out that you have been hiding all of his mail? You know how stubborn he is. If he finds out about the forged loan before we are completely ready to move, he will call the police on us in a heartbeat." Brian let out a low, condescending laugh. He swirled the expensive red wine in his glass, entirely unbothered by the magnitude of his crimes. "You really think I would leave a loose end hanging around?" he replied smoothly. "I have been planning this exit strategy for a year. Dad is not going to call the police, and he is certainly not going to be a problem for us much longer. I have already taken care of the final phase." Megan narrowed her eyes, leaning closer. "What do you mean?" she pressed. "What is the final phase?" Brian set his glass down on the stone table and leaned back. "Do you remember that private doctor I helped out with that massive zoning dispute a few years ago?" he asked. "Dr. Preston? The one who runs that exclusive clinic downtown. He owed me a massive favor for making his commercial property violations quietly disappear. Well, I finally called in that favor." I sat frozen in the squeaky vinyl chair of my motel room, my breath caught painfully in my throat. I listened as my son calmly detailed a plot so fundamentally evil that it made the financial theft look like a minor inconvenience. "I paid Dr. Preston a generous cash consulting fee," Brian continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. "And in exchange, he provided me with a fully signed, highly detailed, and legally binding medical evaluation. It officially diagnoses my father with rapidly declining severe Alzheimer's disease and extreme cognitive dementia. According to this certified medical document, the old man does not even know his own name half the time, let alone possess the mental capacity to manage his financial affairs or recognize his own signature on a bank loan." Megan gasped softly, a wicked smile slowly spreading across her face. "Are you serious?" she whispered. Brian nodded proudly. "I am dead serious. I already had the lawyers draft a medical power of attorney. I forged his signature on that too. It grants me absolute legal control over his health, his living arrangements, and his remaining assets. All I have to do is file the paperwork with the county court next month. Once the judge stamps it, Richard Gibson legally ceases to be an independent adult. I become his official guardian." "And what happens to him then?" Megan asked, her eyes gleaming with greedy excitement. Brian shrugged, picking up his wine glass again. "We do what any caring family would do when dealing with an unmanageable decline in mental health," he said, his tone mocking and cruel. "We put him in a home. Not a nice one, obviously. Those cost way too much money and we need every penny for the new estate. There is a severely underfunded state facility about 3 hours north of here. It is practically a warehouse for forgotten people. The conditions are notoriously awful. We will pack him up, drop him off, and leave him there to rot. If he tries to tell anyone that his son stole his house, the nurses will just pat him on the head and adjust his medication. Nobody believes a raving dementia patient in a state asylum." The video continued to play, but the audio faded into a dull roar inside my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut completely, overwhelmed by a wave of pure, suffocating terror. It was one thing to steal my money. It was one thing to steal the physical house I had built with my own 2 hands. But my son was actively plotting to steal my very mind. He was planning to legally erase my entire existence, strip me of my fundamental human rights, and lock me away in a miserable, neglectful prison for the rest of my natural life. He was going to bury me alive in a state asylum, just so he and his wife could live comfortably in a stolen luxury mansion without ever looking over their shoulders. I opened my eyes and stared at the glowing screen. Brian was now laughing at something Megan said, completely at ease with the horrific destiny he had mapped out for his own father. The sheer psychopathy of his plan was almost impossible to fully comprehend. He had sat across the kitchen table from me every single morning, drinking coffee and making pleasant conversation, all while holding a forged document that would condemn me to a living nightmare. He secretly paid a corrupt doctor to declare me completely insane. The magnitude of the betrayal transcended mere greed. It was a calculated assassination of my freedom and my dignity. I reached out and slammed the heavy black laptop shut. The sudden darkness in the tiny motel room felt incredibly heavy, but my mind had never been clearer. The time for hiding was over. I was going to fight back. I was going to meticulously dismantle their perfect, arrogant lives piece by piece, until they had absolutely nothing left but the devastating consequences of their own monstrous greed. I picked up my new burner phone from the wooden nightstand. I dialed Thomas Keller. We were going to build a trap they could never escape from. I held the cheap plastic phone in my trembling hand, my thumb hovering heavily over the glowing keypad. I had told myself I was ready to dial Thomas Keller. I had told myself I was ready to build a cage for the monsters living in my house. But as the sharp adrenaline of the initial shock began to slowly fade away, a crushing, suffocating wave of profound grief suddenly crashed over my entire body. I could not press the buttons. My fingers simply refused to move. I dropped the phone onto the rickety wooden desk and collapsed back into the squeaky vinyl chair. I buried my weathered face in my calloused hands, and for the first time since my beautiful wife passed away 5 years ago, I completely broke down. I wept. I did not just cry quietly in the dark. I sobbed until my chest physically ached, until my throat burned, and until I could barely draw a single breath. I was mourning a death. It was not a physical death, but it was just as permanent. I was mourning the complete and absolute death of the son I thought I had raised. The tears streamed down my face as my mind forcefully dragged me back through decades of cherished memories. I remembered a bright summer afternoon 35 years ago. I remembered running alongside a small wobbly bicycle on the sidewalk in front of our first house. Brian was 7 years old. He had fallen and scraped his knees on the concrete, crying because he was too afraid to try again. I remembered kneeling down on the pavement, wiping his dirty tears, and telling him that a man is not measured by how many times he falls, but by how bravely he gets back up. I remembered the pride swelling in my chest when he finally pedaled away on his own, laughing into the warm breeze. I remembered sitting with him at the kitchen table when he was a teenager, forcing him to return a $20 bill he had found in a neighbor's driveway. I had looked him squarely in the eyes and told him that honesty was the only currency that truly mattered in this world. I taught him the profound value of a hard-earned dollar. I taught him to respect his elders, to protect his family, and to always stand tall in the face of adversity. How did that innocent, fearful little boy transform into the calculating predator I had just watched on the screen? Where did I go wrong? Did I work too many long hours inspecting building foundations? Did I give him too much, too soon, when he went off to college? The agonizing questions spiraled in my mind, each one a knife twisting into my broken heart. I sat alone in that motel room, paralyzed by the sorrow of a father who failed to protect his own blood from the poison of greed. I cried for the retirement I would never enjoy. I cried for the desecrated memory of my late wife, who would have been utterly devastated to see what our only child had intentionally become behind our backs. The painful weight of his betrayal was almost too heavy for my aging shoulders to bear. I felt incredibly old and vulnerable. I wondered if it would just be easier to surrender, to let him take the money and disappear into the shadows rather than endure the grueling nightmare of fighting my own flesh and blood. But human emotion is a finite resource. Eventually, the tears simply ran dry. The heavy, suffocating sadness began to slowly evaporate from the cramped room. And as the sorrow faded away, it was replaced by something entirely different. A cold quiet and terrifyingly sharp fury began to pool in the pit of my stomach. I lowered my hands from my face and opened my weary eyes. I stared at the dark screen of the laptop resting quietly on the desk. The image of Brian laughing about locking me in a state asylum flashed vividly in my own mind. He was not my son anymore. My son died the moment he forged my signature to steal my life savings. The man sleeping in my house, the man drinking my wine and plotting my psychological demise was a dangerous parasite. He was a heartless criminal who had mistaken my fatherly love for pathetic weakness. I reached up and wiped the dried tears from my rough cheeks. I straightened my posture, my spine popping loudly in the quiet room. The grieving father was gone forever. The seasoned inspector, the man who had spent 30 years successfully hunting down liars, cheats, and fraudsters in the construction business, took his rightful place. I picked up the burner phone from the desk. My hand was no longer shaking. My thumb was steady as I dialed the number for the law office. Thomas Keller answered on the first ring, his voice low and expectant. Rick, Thomas said calmly. What did you see on the drive? I took a deep breath. I saw everything. I replied, my voice sounding like stone. I saw the true face of the man living in my house. I know about the luxury mansion. I know about the fraudulent medical diagnosis. I know exactly what he plans to do to me. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. What do you want to do, Rick? He asked. Do you want me to contact the authorities and file charges for the financial fraud? We can get your money back. I gripped the phone tightly. My eyes locked on the cracked wall. Thomas, I said softly, every word dripping with resolve. I do not just want my money back. I want to destroy them. Have you ever felt the cold realization that someone you love is actually a monster? Tell me in the comments. And keep listening, because the revenge is going to be surgical. I hung up the burner phone, tossing it onto the cheap motel bed. The promise I had just made to Thomas Keller hung in the stale air of the room, heavy and absolute. I did not waste another second wallowing in my grief. I grabbed my thick canvas jacket, slipped the silver flash drive safely into my inner breast pocket, and walked out the door. The drive back to the downtown financial district felt entirely different this time. Earlier this morning, I was a confused, terrified old man looking for answers. Now I was a man with a singular burning purpose. I parked in the same gray concrete garage and made my way up to the 14th floor. Thomas was waiting for me at the glass doors of his firm, having completely bypassed the receptionist. He took one look at my face, saw the hardened resolve in my eyes, and nodded slowly. He led me straight back to his private office, locking the heavy mahogany door behind us for a second time today. Take a seat, Rick Thomas said, his voice stripped of the gentle sympathy from earlier. If we are going to do this, if we are truly going to tear down your son and his criminal enterprise, we need to understand the full scope of what we are dealing with. I sat down in the leather chair, leaning forward. What else is there? I asked, my voice steady. I saw the video. I heard him talk about the fraudulent medical evaluation and the luxury mansion. I know he is stealing everything from me. What more could there possibly be to understand? Thomas did not answer immediately. He reached into the bottom drawer of his polished wooden desk and pulled out a thick blue cardboard folder. He placed it squarely in the center of the desk. The seal of the county police department was stamped in black ink across the front cover. This is the official police report and the forensic crash scene analysis from Sarah's fatal accident, Thomas explained, resting his hand flat on the folder. Because my firm is handling her estate, I was granted full access to the investigator files. I wanted you to see the surveillance footage first, so you would understand the kind of man Brian really is behind closed doors. Now you need to see what happens when someone threatens his perfect life. Thomas opened the thick blue folder. Inside was a stack of glossy photographs and tightly typed official documents. He slid the first few photographs across the desk toward me. They were pictures taken at the crash site on the old highway outside of town. The images were utterly horrifying. Sarah's small silver sedan was completely unrecognizable. The front end was crushed inward like a discarded soda can, the windshield shattered into a million tiny fragments. The vehicle had violently impacted a steep concrete drainage embankment at high speed. Looking at the twisted, scorched metal, I felt a deep, sickening lurch in my stomach. I thought about young Leo, the sweet 10-year-old boy who was now an orphan because of this terrible wreckage. The local police ruled it a tragic single-vehicle accident, Thomas said, his tone turning remarkably cold and clinical. They concluded that Sarah was driving too fast on a dark, winding road, lost control of the vehicle, and crashed. They closed the active investigation less than 48 hours after they pulled her body from the wreckage. I stared at the gruesome photos. It looks like a horrible accident, I admitted quietly, though my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm. Why are you showing me this, Thomas? Thomas pushed a specific document across the desk. It was a vehicle inspection report filled out by the forensic mechanic contracted by the police department. Look at the third paragraph, Thomas instructed, pointing a manicured finger at a block of densely typed text. Half of the paragraph had been heavily redacted with thick black marker, but the first few sentences remained entirely visible. I leaned in and read the unredacted text aloud. Post-crash inspection of the undercarriage reveals catastrophic failure of the primary hydraulic brake lines. Fluid reservoir was completely empty upon arrival at the scene. Now, Thomas said softly, look at this. He reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of white paper. He unfolded it and laid it over the police document. This is a photocopy of the mechanic's original unredacted notes. I acquired this through a private investigator who used to work for the department. Read what the police decided to black out before they officially closed the case. I moved my eyes to the clean copy. My blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. The mechanic had written, "The severed edges of the brake lines do not show signs of natural wear corrosion or stretching typical of a high-speed impact rupture. The lines appear to have been deliberately severed with a sharp, heavy-duty cutting tool. The cut is clean and surgical." I dropped the paper as if it had burned my fingers. I looked up at Thomas, my mind reeling. They were cut, so I whispered, the horrifying reality crashing over me like a tidal wave. Her brakes did not fail. Someone cut them. Thomas nodded grimly. The mechanic flagged it as highly suspicious. He told the lead detective that it looked like intentional sabotage. But the police captain dismissed the findings. He argued that there were absolutely no security cameras on that stretch of road, no witnesses, and no physical evidence linking anyone to the vehicle. The department did not want the massive headache of an unsolved homicide involving a suburban mother. So they chalked the severed lines up to a sharp piece of metal road debris, kicking up into the undercarriage during the crash, redacted the mechanic's professional opinion, and buried the truth in the archives. I sat completely paralyzed in the leather chair. The magnitude of the revelation was suffocating. I had spent the morning grappling with the fact that my son was a white-collar criminal. I had agonized over his cruel plot to declare me mentally incompetent and steal my life savings. But this was entirely different. This was not about forged signatures or stolen money. He killed her, I said, my voice shaking uncontrollably. Brian killed her. He found out she was investigating his firm, so he crawled under her car and cut her brakes. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. We both know he did it, Rick. The timing is entirely too perfect. She was getting incredibly close to exposing his massive money laundering operation. She was a direct existential threat to the luxury mansion, the expensive cars, and his pristine reputation. He could not afford to let her live. A wave of profound nausea washed over me. I pressed my hand over my mouth, fighting the sudden urge to be violently sick. My own son was a murderer. A cold-blooded, calculating killer who murdered a mother and left a child completely alone in the world. And after he did it, he came home, drank my expensive wine, and laughed about his brilliant plans on my patio. We cannot let him get away with this. I choked out, tears of pure rage burning my eyes. We have to take this police report to the authorities. We have to show them the video of him on the patio. Thomas shook his head firmly. No, Rick, not yet. We cannot go to the police right now. The cut brake lines are highly suspicious, but they are entirely circumstantial. The police already dismissed that evidence once. The video proves he is stealing from you, but it does not prove he touched her car. If we go to the authorities with this right now, Brian's expensive defense lawyers will tear our case apart. They will claim you are a confused old man. They will use his fraudulent Alzheimer's diagnosis to completely discredit your testimony. He will walk away a free man, and he will accelerate his plan to lock you in that state asylum permanently. I slammed my fist down hard on the mahogany desk, the sharp pain shooting up my arm. Then what do we do? I demanded angrily. How do we stop a monster who has thought of absolutely everything? Thomas leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine with an intense, burning clarity. We find the one piece of evidence he forgot to hide, he said quietly. We go back to the flash drive. Because Sarah knew he was coming for her, and she left us one final clue. Let me show you what she recorded on the very last night of her life. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out the small silver flash drive. My fingers felt numb as I handed it across the wide mahogany desk. Thomas took it silently and inserted it into a secure port on his sleek desktop computer. He clicked through the nested folders I had navigated just hours ago in my dreary motel room. But he bypassed the video files I had watched. He scrolled all the way to the very bottom of the directory, locating a single audio file. The file was named with a date. It was the exact date of the night before Sarah died in that twisted wreckage on the old highway. Thomas clicked his mouse. A harsh wave of static hissed through the high-quality speakers on his desk, followed immediately by the sound of ragged, heavy breathing. Then a voice spoke. It was a woman's voice kept to a desperate, trembling whisper. It was Sarah. Hearing her speak, knowing she was already lying beneath the frozen earth of that empty cemetery, sent a violent shiver down my spine. This is Sarah Jenkins, the recording began, her voice shaking, with raw, unfiltered terror. It is 2:15 in the morning. I am recording this audio log as a primary failsafe. I am locked in my upstairs bedroom. Leo is asleep down the hall. I just saw something that changes everything about this investigation, and I need this documented in case something happens to me before I can reach the authorities. I leaned closer to the speakers, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could not sleep. Sarah's recorded voice continued, the static hissing softly in the background. I got up to get a glass of water and looked out my window down into the driveway. The streetlights were completely blocked out by that massive wooden fence Richard's son built last year. I always wondered why he built it so high and so solid. Now I know, The fence was never meant to keep me out of their yard. It was built specifically to create a blind spot. It casts a huge pitch-black shadow over my entire driveway, completely shielding my car from the street, from the neighbors, and from passing police patrols. It was not a privacy wall. It was a tactical barrier. A heavy lump formed in my throat as her words washed over me. The deafening chainsaws, the rushed construction, Brian's frantic, aggressive insistence that we needed the 10-foot barricade to protect our property from a dangerous addict. It was all an elaborate, premeditated staging ground. He had engineered a perfectly hidden corridor between our properties. I saw him, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with fear. I saw Brian Gibson climbing over the top of the fence. He dropped silently into my driveway. He was wearing dark clothes and carrying a small metal toolbox. He looked around to make sure no one was watching from the street, but he knew they could not see him. The fence hid him perfectly. Then he slid completely underneath my car. My breath caught. I gripped the wooden arms of the leather chair so tightly my joints ached. He was under there for about 10 minutes, Sarah reported, the terror in her tone escalating. I could hear the faint clinking of metal tools. I could hear him working on something near the front driver's side wheel well. I did not know what to do. I am alone in this house with my son. If I turn on the floodlights or call out to him, he will know I am watching. He knows I am investigating his firm. If he realizes I saw him tampering with my vehicle, he might try to break into the house. I cannot risk Leo's safety. I have to stay perfectly quiet. There was a long, agonizing pause in the recording. I could hear her swallowing hard, trying to maintain her professional composure in the face of a direct, lethal threat. He just crawled out, whispered, sounding breathless. He wiped his hands on a rag, climbed back over the high wooden fence, and dropped back into his father's yard. He is gone. But I know he did something to my car. I know he sabotaged it. I am not going to wait around to find out what his next move is. As soon as the sun comes up, I am packing a bag. I am going to take Leo, and we are driving straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office downtown. I have the flash drive with the patio recordings. I am going to mail a backup to Thomas Keller first thing in the morning. If you are listening to this, Thomas, it means I did not make it. It means Brian Gibson stopped me. The audio file ended with a sharp click, followed by absolute silence in the mahogany office. The silence was heavier than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. It pressed down on my chest, threatening to crush the breath right out of my lungs. Thomas slowly turned away from the computer monitor and looked at me. His eyes were dark and serious. She mailed the package to my office at 8 in the morning, Thomas said quietly. She must have decided to drive Leo to a safe location before heading to the authorities. But she never made it to the highway exit. The brake lines gave out on the steepest curve of the road. She fought the wheel trying to save her son, but the car was moving too fast. I sat frozen, the horrifying reality wrapping around my throat like a vice. The chainsaws on that Saturday morning had not been the sound of home improvement. They had been the sound of my son building a murder weapon. He had carefully measured the sight lines. He had calculated the height needed to block the street lamps. He had used my property, my money, and my misplaced trust to construct the very tool he needed to execute a single mother in cold blood. And the most agonizing part of it all was the tragic irony of her final decision. She knew he tampered with the car. She knew it was dangerous. But in her desperate panic to get her young son to safety, she took a calculated risk that cost her everything. He built the fence so he could kill her, I whispered, my voice sounding completely hollow in the quiet office. He built it right in front of my face, and I let him do it. Thomas leaned across the desk, his gaze piercing through my devastating guilt. You did not know, Rick. You are a good man who trusted his family. Brian manipulated your love to cover his tracks. But now we have her voice. We have her final testimony. This audio log connects the fence, the trespassing, and the sabotage directly to him on the exact night before the crash. I looked at the black computer speakers. Sarah's terrified whisper still echoed in the corners of my mind. The grief and the guilt coalesced, hardening into an unbreakable diamond of pure, righteous wrath. My son was a monster who thought he had outsmarted the entire world. He thought he had buried his sins under 10 feet of solid wood and a forged medical diagnosis. But he had left a trail. "We have to make him confess," I said, my voice gaining a dangerous, icy edge. "A recording is powerful, but a confession will bury him." "How do we draw him out, Thomas? How do we trap a killer who thinks he has already won?" Thomas nodded, a grim satisfaction crossing his face. "We bring in the heavy artillery," he said. He picked up his desk phone. "It is time to call the federal agents." Thomas picked up his desk phone and dialed a direct number. He spoke in clipped sentences mentioning Sarah's name and the financial intelligence firm. Within 30 minutes, there was a sharp knock at the mahogany door. Thomas unlocked it to let in a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark, unremarkable suit. The man introduced himself as Special Agent Harris. He offered no polite smile or a warm handshake. His eyes were entirely focused, scanning the room before settling heavily on me. Thomas quickly briefed him on the entire situation. He handed over the stack of forged bank documents, the foreclosure notices, and the county police report regarding Sarah's fatal crash. Finally, Thomas played the audio recording of Sarah's desperate final log, followed by the patio video, where Brian coldly discussed the fraudulent medical diagnosis. Agent Harris listened to everything in absolute silence. He did not interrupt. He did not take notes. He just absorbed the horrifying reality of what my son had done. When the video finally ended, Harris let out a slow, measured breath. He walked over to the window, looking out over the sprawling city skyline before turning back to face us. "We have him dead to rights on the financial crimes," Harris said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "The forged signatures, the wire fraud, the money laundering through the luxury mansion purchase. I can have a tactical team at your house in an hour to arrest Brian and his wife for the financial theft. But there is a massive problem with the murder charge." I frowned, leaning forward in my leather chair. "What problem?" I asked, the frustration instantly flaring up in my chest. "You just heard her voice. You heard her say she watched him crawl under her car the night before her brakes completely failed." Harris nodded slowly. "I heard her, Rick, and I believe her. But in a court of law, that audio log is legally considered circumstantial evidence. Sarah is not here to testify. A high-priced defense attorney will tear that recording to shreds. They will argue that she was a paranoid investigator who hated your son. They will claim someone else hopped the fence, or that the brake failure was just a tragic mechanical coincidence, exactly like the local police initially ruled. If I arrest Brian for the fraud today, he will immediately demand a lawyer. He will never say another word about the crash. We will never be able to officially pin the murder on him. He will serve a few years in prison for the financial crimes, and he will get away with killing a mother." The thought of Brian sitting in a cozy prison cell, breathing the air that Sarah was permanently robbed of, made my blood boil. "We cannot let that happen," I stated firmly, looking Agent Harris directly in the eyes. "Tell me exactly what you need to put him away for the rest of his natural life." Harris walked back over to the desk and leaned down, placing both of his hands flat on the polished wood. "I need a confession," he said bluntly. "I need a crystal-clear, undeniably recorded admission of guilt coming straight from his own mouth. And the only person he is going to brag to is the person he thinks he has completely defeated. He thinks you are a frail old man suffering from cognitive decline. We need to use his twisted ego against him. I want to put a hidden wire on you, Rick. I want you to go back to that house, look your son in the eye, and bait him into confessing to the murder on tape." The sheer danger of the request hung heavily in the air. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, warning Harris that I was not a trained operative. I was an old building inspector with a mountain of grief. I raised my hand, silencing him. "I will do it," I said without a second of hesitation. Agent Harris nodded, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his hardened features. He opened his dark briefcase and pulled out a small, incredibly thin recording device connected to a tiny microphone. He instructed me to take off my heavy canvas jacket and unbutton my shirt. His hands were quick and professional as he taped the wire flat against my chest, right over my furiously beating heart. He ran the microphone up along my collarbone, hiding it perfectly beneath the fabric of my undershirt. "This transmitter sends a live audio feed directly to a secure receiver in my vehicle," Harris explained, checking the secure tape. "I will be parked inside a surveillance van 3 blocks down the street from your property. My tactical team will be waiting just out of sight. But you have to listen to me very carefully, Rick. Brian is a cornered, arrogant killer. He believes he holds all the cards. You have to play your part perfectly. You cannot accuse him directly. You cannot show him your anger. You have to be the sick, confused father he thinks you are. If you push him too hard, if you make one wrong move, he will realize it is a trap. If he suspects you are wearing a wire, he will run, or worse, he might become violently desperate, right there in the dining room. You are walking into the lion's den." I buttoned my shirt back up, feeling the cold, hard plastic of the transmitter pressing against my skin. I understood the massive stakes. I was not just fighting for my stolen retirement money anymore. I was fighting for Sarah, for little Leo, and for justice. I put my thick jacket back on, and looked at the two men. "I am ready," I said softly. I slowly turned around and walked out the door, preparing to return to the dark house of lies and face the monster. I walked out of the towering glass building and stepped into the cold afternoon air, the tiny transmitter resting flush against my chest like a hidden shield of armor. The drive back to the suburbs felt entirely different from my frantic escape just days prior. Every single mile that rolled beneath the heavy tires of my truck was a mile closer to the final, inevitable confrontation. I used the quiet, solitary time in the cabin to meticulously rehearse my upcoming performance. I could not be the righteous, angry father who knew all of their devastating secrets. I could not let a single ounce of my burning fury bleed through my carefully constructed facade. I had to become the exact victim they had specifically designed their cruel plot around. I pulled onto my quiet street, the familiar towering oak trees casting long, intricate, and beautiful shadows across the cracked pavement. As I turned slowly into my own driveway, my eyes immediately darted toward the massive 10-foot wooden fence looming ominously on the edge of the property line. Knowing what that barricade had truly been used for made a fresh, acidic wave of bile rise in the back of my throat, but I forcefully swallowed it down. I parked the truck, turned off the engine, and took one final deep breath to steady my racing, pounding heart. I let my shoulders slump heavily forward, intentionally rounding my posture to physically mimic the crushing, suffocating weight of extreme exhaustion and total defeat. I stepped out of the heavy vehicle, intentionally dragging my feet across the concrete as I slowly made my way up the front walkway. I opened the front door, the familiar brass chime echoing brightly through the quiet, expansive foyer. The house smelled faintly of expensive vanilla candles and roasted garlic, a stark, sickening contrast to the sterile, terrifying reality of the horrific crimes committed within these very walls. I heard the low, murmuring sound of the television coming from the living room. I shuffled my feet audibly against the polished hardwood floor, ensuring they could clearly hear my slow, unsteady, and pathetic approach. I reached out and leaned heavily against the hallway wall, acting as though just standing upright required a monumental, agonizing physical effort. Brian and Megan appeared in the doorway of the living room. They both froze, clearly shocked and alarmed to see me returning from my supposed Florida fishing trip more than a week early. I looked up at them, keeping my eyes wide, unfocused, and entirely vacant. I let my hands begin to tremble visibly at my sides, my fingers twitching against my thighs. Brian was the first to speak, stepping forward with a perfectly crafted mask of sudden concern plastered securely across his handsome face. "Dad," he asked, his voice thick with fake, practiced worry. "What are you doing home so early? Did something happen down at the cabin?" I did not answer him right away. I simply stared at him, letting a look of profound, helpless confusion wash over my wrinkled features, as if I could not entirely comprehend the simple question he had just asked me. I slowly took off my thick canvas jacket, letting it slip clumsily from my trembling fingers and fall directly onto the clean floor. I did not bother to bend down and pick it up. I just muttered a vague, entirely incoherent greeting and shuffled right past them, making my way directly into the bright kitchen. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, watching my every unsteady, fragile movement with intense predatory interest. I walked over to the expensive coffee maker resting on the pristine marble counter. My hands shook violently as I reached upward for a ceramic mug from the open wooden cabinet. I grabbed the glass carafe of leftover morning coffee, lifted it with both hands, and deliberately allowed my grip to falter. The heavy carafe tilted too far forward. Dark, cold coffee spilled over the rim of the mug, splashing aggressively across the white marble countertop and dripping rapidly down the front of the custom wooden cabinets onto the floor. I dropped the carafe back onto the heating pad with a loud jarring clatter and took a stumbling, clumsy step backward. I stared at the dark brown puddle spreading across the immaculate kitchen island, raising my shaking hands to my face in mock horror. "Oh no," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly to convey a deep, pathetic sense of absolute helplessness. "Look at what I did. I made a terrible, terrible mess. I just wanted a simple cup of coffee, but my hands simply will not stop shaking today." Megan rushed into the kitchen quickly, grabbing a roll of paper towels from the holder. "Oh, Richard, please do not worry about it at all," she cooed, wiping up the spilled liquid with an exaggerated, sickly sweet patience. "It is just a little spill. Why do you not go sit down before you accidentally hurt yourself?" I allowed Brian to gently guide me by the elbow toward one of the tall, cushioned bar stools. I sat down heavily, resting my elbows on the cold counter and burying my face deeply in my hands. I let out a long, ragged, and wet sigh that shuddered visibly through my entire frame. Brian stood next to me, resting a comforting, warm hand on my hunched shoulder, playing the role of the devoted, dutiful son to absolute, terrifying perfection. "Are you feeling ill, Dad?" he asked softly, leaning in close. "You look completely and utterly exhausted." I slowly lowered my hands and looked up into his cold, calculating eyes. I forced a single, genuine tear of sorrow to spill over my lower lash line, though the sorrow was strictly for the innocent son I had permanently lost, not for the sharp mind I was currently pretending to lose. "Brian," I began, keeping my voice incredibly weak, raspy, and trembling. "You know my memory. It is getting so incredibly bad lately. I was driving down the highway toward Florida and suddenly, I just could not remember where I was going. I pulled over to the side of the road, and I sat there in the dark for hours, trying to remember the name of my own best friend. I looked around the kitchen, letting my eyes dart nervously and erratically from the stainless steel refrigerator to the large glass windows. "I think I am losing my mind," I whispered, injecting a tone of pure, unadulterated fear and panic into the quiet, tense room. "I am forgetting things, important things. The house, the monthly bills, the mail. It is all becoming a massive, terrifying, and dark blur to me." I reached out and weakly grabbed his forearm, my fingers clutching his expensive suit jacket. "I cannot do this anymore, Brian. I am too old, and my brain is completely failing me. I need you to take control of everything for me. I need you to handle the house, the finances, all of it." For a brief, fleeting, and highly revealing moment, the carefully constructed mask of concern slipped completely from Brian's face. He quickly glanced across the kitchen island at Megan. In the span of a single silent heartbeat, I saw them exchange a wicked, triumphant, and deeply malicious smile. It was a look of pure, unrestrained, predatory victory. They honestly and truly believed the corrupt private doctor's fake diagnosis was miraculously coming true right before their very eyes. They believed I was willingly, voluntarily surrendering the final keys to my kingdom without a single fight. Brian quickly smoothed his sharp features back into an expression of solemn, heavy duty. He covered my trembling, aged hand with his own, squeezing it reassuringly. "Dad, please do not worry about a single thing," he said, his voice dripping with a sickening, artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl violently beneath the hidden wire. "You just rest. I will take care of absolutely everything from now on. You have my word." I nodded slowly, bowing my head, as if a massive crushing weight had finally been lifted from my tired shoulders, while the cold, hard microphone resting flat against my chest quietly recorded every single damning syllable of his twisted, arrogant victory. By the time evening arrived, the house was filled with the rich, savory aroma of roasted lamb and garlic herbs. Megan had spent the entire afternoon preparing an incredibly lavish dinner. To an outsider, it would have looked like a beautiful family gathering a daughter-in-law, lovingly cooking a comforting meal for her ailing father-in-law. But I knew the horrifying truth. This was not a dinner of comfort. This was a dark, twisted celebration. They were celebrating my complete surrender. They were celebrating the fast-approaching reality of their luxury mansion, funded entirely by my stolen life savings and my impending banishment to a state asylum. I sat at the head of the heavy mahogany dining table, staring down at my expensive porcelain plate. I pushed the perfectly cooked meat around with my silver fork, making sure my hand trembled just enough to clatter the metal against the china. I did not have much of an appetite anyway. The tiny plastic transmitter taped flat against my chest felt incredibly hot. A constant burning reminder of the federal agents sitting in a dark surveillance van just 3 blocks down the street, listening to every single breath I took. Brian sat directly across from me, pouring himself a generous glass of the vintage wine he had opened for the special occasion. He was practically glowing with a sickening, triumphant energy. He smiled warmly, holding his crystal glass up in a mock toast to my fading health. He spent the entire meal speaking in a soft, patronizing tone, assuring me that I had made the right decision, that I had carried the heavy burden of the household for far too long, and that it was finally his turn to be the responsible man of the house. Megan chimed in gently, offering sweet, poisonous reassurances about how much they both loved me and how they would ensure I received the absolute best possible care for my rapidly declining memory. Every word they spoke was a polished, calculated lie, meticulously designed to keep me completely docile, while they quietly slipped the final financial noose around my unsuspecting neck. I played my tragic role without missing a single beat. I nodded slowly, staring blankly at the flickering candles in the center of the table, occasionally letting out a heavy, confused sigh to sell the illusion. When the dinner plates were finally cleared, and Megan brought out a rich chocolate dessert, the atmosphere in the room subtly shifted. The pleasant, casual dinner conversation completely faded away. Brian wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, stood up from his chair, and walked out of the formal dining room for a brief moment. When he finally returned, he was holding a sleek black leather folder. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thick and suffocating. My heart began to pound, a frantic, dangerous rhythm against my ribs, thumping so loudly I genuinely feared the hidden microphone would pick up the desperate sound. Brian walked over to my end of the table and stood directly beside my high-backed chair. He opened the dark leather folder and gently laid it flat on the polished wood right next to my untouched dessert plate. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents neatly clipped together with bright yellow sticky notes pointing to several blank signature lines. Dad, Brian said softly, his voice a perfect imitation of gentle concern. I had the lawyers draw up the preliminary paperwork we talked about this afternoon. This is just a standard agreement. It allows me to legally step in and handle the bank accounts, pay the property taxes, and manage the mortgage so you do not have to stress about the confusing numbers anymore. It is just a simple formality to make sure the bank lets me talk to them on your behalf. I looked down at the documents. The bold heading at the very top of the first page clearly read, Medical and Durable Power of Attorney. It was the exact document he had laughed about on the patio recording. It was the absolute legal authority that would allow him to forcibly commit me to a neglectful state facility and completely liquidate my remaining estate without my permission. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy gold pen he had intentionally placed beside the folder. My hand shook violently. I hovered the sharp tip of the pen just an inch above the crisp white paper. The silence in the dining room was absolute, heavy, and pregnant with dark anticipation. I could feel Brian and Megan holding their collective breath, their greedy eyes locked intensely on the tip of the gold pen. They were mere seconds away from legally stealing my absolute freedom. I let the pen hover for a few more agonizing seconds, deliberately, building the unbearable tension in the quiet room. I thought about the federal agents sitting in the dark van waiting for my signal. I thought about Sarah. I slowly lowered my hand, pulling the pen away from the signature line. I placed it gently back onto the polished mahogany table and pulled my trembling hands into my lap. I looked up at Brian, my eyes wide, vulnerable, and brimming with perfectly manufactured fear. "I am scared, Brian," I whispered, my voice intentionally cracking with fragile emotion. "I am so incredibly scared of what is happening to my failing mind. If I sign my life over to you, what if other people find out I am confused? What if bad people try to take advantage of my memory while you are away?" Brian frowned, his perfect mask slipping slightly, with immediate frustration at the unexpected delay. "Dad, absolutely no one is going to take advantage of you. I am going to protect you." I vigorously shook my head, shrinking back. "But the world is full of dangerous people," I pleaded. "What about people like that crazy neighbor, Sarah? I am terrified. What if she hurts me? Please." Brian let out a harsh, incredulous breath. He looked down at me as if I were a pathetic, shivering child, frightened by a completely imaginary monster hiding under the bed. He glanced across the table at Megan, who simply rolled her eyes and took another long sip of her dark red wine, clearly irritated by my sudden hesitation. Brian turned his attention back to me, leaning his elbows heavily onto the polished mahogany table. The warm, flickering light from the center candles cast deep, sinister shadows across his sharp features, highlighting the cold annoyance tightening his jaw. "Dad, listen to yourself," Brian said, his voice laced with a thick, heavy layer of condescension. "You are completely losing your grip on reality. Sarah is gone. She is dead. She was in a horrible car accident 9 months ago, remember? You went to her empty funeral. She cannot possibly hurt you or anyone else ever again. You have to stop dwelling on these paranoid delusions. It is exactly why you need to sign these legal papers right now. You are clearly not well enough to distinguish a real threat from a fabricated memory." I kept my hands firmly in my lap, refusing to reach for the heavy gold pen. I let my head drop slightly, shaking it back and forth in a slow, erratic rhythm. But she was so dangerous, I whimpered, keeping my voice frail and broken. "You told me she was dangerous, Brian. You told me she was creeping around our backyard in the middle of the night. You built that massive wooden fence to keep her away from us. What if she told other people about our house? What if her drug addict friends come looking for whatever she was searching for? I am too weak to defend this property. I failed to protect us from her. If she had wanted to destroy this family, I would have been completely powerless to stop her." I watched the muscles in Brian's jaw tighten. I was intentionally pressing right against the absolute core of his massive, fragile ego. He had always desperately craved total control and ultimate superiority. By acting pathetic, by claiming I was powerless, while simultaneously bringing up the very woman who had almost dismantled his entire criminal empire, I was actively baiting the darkest part of his pride. He could not stand the thought of me believing that Sarah had ever held any real power over him. He needed to be the undisputed victor. He needed to prove to his helpless, failing father that he was the ultimate protector, a completely untouchable force who had conquered every single obstacle in his path. Brian let out a low, dark chuckle. He pushed his half-empty crystal wineglass to the side and leaned aggressively forward across the table, closing the physical distance between us. The pleasant, artificial warmth completely vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating arrogance that made my blood run entirely cold. He was practically vibrating with a twisted sense of absolute invincibility. "Dad, I need you to look at me," Brian commanded softly, his tone dropping into a chilling, conspiratorial whisper. I slowly raised my head, meeting his dead, emotionless gaze. "I told you that I handle everything for this family." He continued, emphasizing every single word with a terrifying, calm precision. "I am the one who protects us. You do not ever need to worry about people like Sarah Jenkins. People who try to snoop around where they do not belong, people who try to threaten everything I have built. They always get exactly what is coming to them in the end. Nobody messes with this family and walks away. Absolutely nobody." I forced my eyes to widen, letting my mouth fall open in a silent display of manufactured shock. "What are you saying, Brian?" I stammered, my voice trembling violently. "The police said she just crashed. They said it was a tragic accident on the old highway." Brian smiled. It was not a smile of joy, but a wretched, evil stretching of his lips. It was the smile of a predator admiring its own bloody kill. "The police are complete fools, Dad. They only see exactly what I want them to see. It was not an accident. I made sure of it. I did not build that 10-foot fence just to keep her from looking into our yard. I built it so I could have a permanent hidden shadow over her driveway. She was getting way too close to my business. She was a massive liability, and I simply removed her from the board." My breath caught genuinely in my throat. I did not have to fake the sheer horror washing over my face. "Tell me you did not hurt her," I whispered, leaning back against the tall wooden chair. Brian scoffed, sitting back and crossing his arms over his chest, with an air of absolute chilling victory. "I took care of her brakes, Dad. I waited until the middle of the night. I climbed over that fence, and I crawled right underneath her car. I cut the hydraulic lines clean through. It took me less than 15 minutes. By the time she reached that steep curve on the highway the next morning, she did not have a prayer. And the best part is no one even suspected a thing." They filed the report and threw it in a dusty drawer. The dining room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The confession hung in the air, crisp, clear, and undeniably damning. Every single terrifying syllable had been perfectly captured by the hidden federal microphone taped securely against my chest. "So you just signed the papers," Brian said, gesturing toward the leather folder with a casual flick of his wrist. "Sign the power of attorney, Dad. Let me take over. Because if I can handle a massive threat like her without breaking a single sweat, I can easily handle your bank accounts. You are safe with me. I will take care of anyone else who ever tries to get in our way." I stared at the man sitting across the table, my own flesh and blood, casually boasting about the premeditated murder of a young mother as if he had simply taken out the weekly trash. His complete lack of remorse was staggering. He felt no guilt for the orphan he had created, no sorrow for the life he had violently stolen. He only felt an immense, intoxicating pride in his own ruthless intelligence. Beside him, Megan simply smiled, taking another sip of her wine, completely unfazed by the horrific confession she had just witnessed. They were both entirely devoid of basic human empathy, operating on a level of pure, unadulterated selfishness that I could scarcely comprehend. The heavy gold pen rested quietly on the table between us, the legal document designed to strip me of my freedom and lock me away in a miserable state asylum, waited patiently for my forged consent. My hands had completely stopped shaking. The facade of the frail, terrified old man had served its exact vital purpose. The trap had been flawlessly executed, and the arrogant lion had walked directly into the steel cage without a single moment of hesitation. I could feel the tiny transmitter warming the skin over my heart, an invisible tether connecting me to the armed federal agents waiting quietly in the dark just beyond my front door. The agonizing, suffocating nightmare that had consumed my entire existence for the past week was finally coming to a decisive end. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the rich, savory scent of the lavish dinner into my lungs and prepared to drop the curtain on my son's grand, tragic performance. I exhaled that long, deep breath, and as the air left my lungs, the frail old man completely vanished. The violent trembling in my hands ceased. I relaxed my fingers, releasing the heavy gold pen. It clattered against the polished mahogany table, rolling away from the fraudulent legal documents. I unhunched my shoulders, straightening my spine against the back of the tall dining chair. The deliberate shift in my posture was subtle but undeniably powerful. I was no longer shrinking away from him. I raised my head, letting the mask of pathetic confusion melt away, and locked my eyes directly onto Brian. My gaze was dead cold and entirely devoid of the warmth he had exploited. Brian stopped talking mid-sentence. His confident, predatory smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine uncertainty. He looked at the pen resting uselessly on the table, then back up at my hardened face. "Dad," he asked, his voice losing its condescending edge, a sliver of real hesitation creeping in. "What are you doing?" "Sign the paper." I did not reach for the pen. I simply sat there, radiating a quiet, dangerous authority that he had never seen in me before. I let the silence stretch for a few more agonizing seconds, allowing him to fully process the terrifying transformation happening right in front of his eyes. "You are right, Brian," I said. My voice was no longer raspy or weak. It rang out through the formal dining room, deep, steady, and echoing with absolute conviction. "The neighborhood is very dangerous." Brian blinked, completely thrown off balance by the sudden strength in my tone. He leaned back slightly, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Megan lowered her crystal wine glass, the bored annoyance on her face shifting into nervous caution. "What are you talking about?" Brian demanded, a sudden sharp edge of panic threading through his words. "You are not making any sense. Stop playing games and sign the document." I leaned forward, resting my forearms firmly on the table. "I am not playing games, Brian," I replied smoothly. "But you are absolutely right. People who try to threaten everything I have built and always get exactly what is coming to them in the end. Nobody messes with this family and walks away." Before Brian could even begin to comprehend the fact that I was throwing his own murderous words right back into his face, the world outside the dining room completely exploded. A blinding cascade of intense red and blue strobe lights suddenly ignited the darkness outside the large dining room windows. The vibrant, chaotic colors slashed through the sheer curtains, washing over the expensive mahogany furniture and painting his terrified face in alternating flashes of crimson and sapphire. For a split second, both Brian and Megan sat completely frozen, paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming visual assault. Then a deafening, thunderous crash violently shook the entire foundation of the house. The heavy, custom-built, solid oak front door was kicked completely off its reinforced steel hinges with the force of a battering ram. The explosive sound of splintering wood and shattering glass echoed terribly through the high ceilings of the quiet suburban sanctuary. Heavy tactical boots slammed rhythmically against the polished hardwood floors of the foyer. Deep, commanding voices roared through the hallway, demanding absolute compliance. "Federal agents, get down on the ground right now," the voices bellowed, echoing with terrifying, practiced authority. The formal dining room was instantly flooded with a dozen heavily armed men wearing dark tactical gear and ballistic helmets. They swarmed into the room with breathtaking speed and precision. Bright, blinding flashlights mounted on heavy tactical rifles cut through the dim, romantic candlelight, pinning Brian and Megan to their chairs. Small, bright red laser sights danced aggressively across the chest of his expensive, tailored suit jacket. Megan let out a piercing, hysterical scream. The delicate crystal wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering into 100 glittering pieces against the floor, splashing dark red wine across the pristine rug like spilled blood. "Do not move a single muscle," a SWAT officer roared, pointing his weapon directly at his chest. "Keep your hands exactly where I can see them." Brian was completely immobilized by pure, unadulterated shock. The arrogant predator who had just boasted about executing a mother in cold blood was instantly reduced to a terrified, trembling coward. He slowly raised his hands into the air, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. Megan sobbed uncontrollably, pressing her hands over her ears to block out the chaotic shouting, completely unable to process the sudden violent destruction of her perfect lavish lifestyle. From the chaotic sea of dark tactical uniforms, Special Agent Harris slowly stepped forward into the dining room. He looked absolutely imposing in his dark suit, his face an impenetrable mask of federal authority. He bypassed the screaming woman and the trembling man, walking directly up to the head of the table. He looked down at me, giving a sharp, respectful nod. "You got it all, Rick?" he asked, his deep voice carrying easily over the loud, chaotic securing of the room. I reached up, unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of my shirt, and pulled the hidden wire out into the open air. "I got every single word," I replied calmly. Special Agent Harris slowly turned his cold, unforgiving gaze toward Brian. Brian stared at the tiny microphone dangling from my collar, his eyes widening in absolute horrifying realization. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He finally understood the true depth of the fatal mistake he had made. The frail old man he had mocked, the father he had callously manipulated and planned to lock away in an asylum, had just orchestrated his absolute downfall. Brian Gibson, Agent Harris, stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive financial embezzlement, and the premeditated murder of Sarah Jenkins." The word murder hung heavily in the air of the formal dining room, heavy and absolute, suffocating the remnants of their lavish celebration. For a moment, the only sounds were the heavy breathing of the tactical officers and the sharp crackle of police radios. Then the fragile facade that Megan had spent years carefully constructing violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The reality of federal prison, of losing the luxury mansion and her expensive lifestyle, crashed down upon her. She stopped sobbing and slowly looked at the man sitting beside her. Her eyes, usually filled with calculated greed, were now wide with an intense, furious panic. She scrambled backward, her chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor, trying to put as much physical distance between herself and Brian as the armed agents would allow. I did not know, she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the high ceilings. "I did not know anything about a murder. He told me it was just a financial technicality. He told me he just paid off a doctor. I had nothing to do with that woman next door. He is a monster. Tell them, Brian. Tell them I had absolutely nothing to do with it." She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at her husband's chest, throwing him to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. The devoted, loving wife who had eagerly plotted to lock me away in a miserable state asylum was now desperately clawing for her own survival, completely willing to watch him drown if it meant saving herself. Brian did not even look at her. He could not. The towering, arrogant predator who had casually boasted about cutting a young mother's brake lines had completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic hollow shell of a man. 2 heavily armed tactical officers stepped forward, forcefully grabbing him by the shoulders of his tailored suit jacket and yanking him up from the dining chair. The sheer physical force, combined with the crushing weight of his absolute ruin, was entirely too much for him to bear. His legs simply gave out beneath him. Brian collapsed, dropping heavily onto his knees right there on the wine-stained rug. He was trembling so violently that his teeth chattered audibly in the quiet room. Then a dark, humiliating stain began to rapidly spread across the front of his expensive gray slacks, pooling onto the floor beneath him. He had quite literally wet himself in a state of pure, unadulterated terror. The wealthy, sophisticated real estate manager was gone. He looked up at me from the floor, his face completely pale and slick with a cold sweat. Tears streamed down his cheeks, mixing with the pathetic whimpers escaping his throat. "Dad." He choked out, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. "Daddy, please. Please help me. You have to tell them I did not mean it. You have to tell them I am a good person. Please do not let them take me away." He reached out a shaking hand toward my leg, his fingers grasping desperately at the empty air between us. It was the ultimate pitiful act of a cornered coward. After spending months systematically destroying my life, stealing my retirement, and plotting to erase my very existence, his immediate instinct was to beg the frail old man he despised to miraculously save him from the devastating consequences of his own horrific actions. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the broken, weeping creature kneeling on my dining room floor. If this had happened a year ago, my heart would have completely shattered. I would have moved heaven and earth to protect my child from any harm. But the man bleeding tears and begging for mercy was not my son. My son had died the very moment he picked up a pen and forged my signature to steal the home I built for him. The man on the floor was just a dangerous parasite, a cold-blooded killer who had finally been caught in a trap of his own arrogant design. I looked at his desperate, pleading eyes, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left. There was no sorrow. There was only a profound, hollow emptiness where my fatherly love used to reside. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I did not scream at him. I simply turned my body, stepped cleanly over his outstretched, trembling hand, and began to walk away. I walked past the federal agents, past Megan, who was now being forcefully handcuffed and pushed against the wall. And I stepped out through the shattered frame of my front door. The cool, crisp night air immediately rushed over my face completely, washing away the suffocating stench of expensive wine-roasted garlic and toxic lies. I stood on the damp grass of my front lawn, pulling my canvas jacket tighter around my shoulders. The entire suburban street was illuminated by the strobing red and blue lights of half a dozen police cruisers and federal vehicles. Neighbors were standing on their porches, wrapping robes around themselves, watching the chaotic scene unfold in stunned, absolute silence. I stood perfectly still in the shadows, watching as two tactical officers dragged Brian out of the house. His head was bowed, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, his expensive suit ruined and stained. They shoved him roughly into the back of a dark cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut. A brief moment later, Megan was let out, her head ducked down to avoid the prying eyes of the neighborhood she had once looked down upon. As the engines roared to life and the cruisers began to slowly pull away from the curb, a massive, invisible weight lifted from my chest. The toxic rot that had silently infected my home and my family had finally been excised. I took a deep, clear breath of the autumn air, feeling truly safe for the very first time in months. 6 months passed since that night. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but they ground with absolute, unforgiving certainty. I sat in the cold wooden pews of the federal courthouse wearing the same dark suit I had worn to Sarah Jenkins's lonely funeral. The grand room was completely silent as the heavy oak doors closed, sealing the fate of the man I used to call my son. Brian sat at the defense table looking like a hollow shell of his former self. His expensive tailored suits had been permanently replaced by a bright orange jumpsuit. The arrogant, condescending smirk he once wore like a crown was entirely gone, replaced by the terrified, sunken eyes of a man who finally understood that his actions had irreversible consequences. The federal prosecutor had built an incredibly airtight case heavily supported by the audio recordings, the financial documents Thomas Keller had unearthed, and the undeniable confession Brian had made directly into the hidden FBI microphone. There was no leniency to be found. I watched without a single ounce of pity as the honorable judge struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. He sentenced Brian Gibson to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive financial embezzlement, and the premeditated manslaughter of Sarah Jenkins. 25 years. By the time he ever saw the outside world again, he would be an old, broken man, entirely forgotten by the society he had tried so desperately to manipulate. Megan did not fare much better in the aftermath. Although she avoided direct prison time by aggressively testifying against her husband and claiming total ignorance of the murder, the federal government showed her absolutely no financial mercy. They systematically seized every single asset purchased with my stolen money, completely liquidating the luxury mansion she had so proudly bought for her parents. She was left entirely bankrupt, stripped of the glamorous lifestyle she had worshipped above all else. I recently heard through a mutual acquaintance that she is now working grueling night shifts as a waitress at a 24-hour roadside diner just to pay her basic rent. She traded a life of stolen luxury for a reality of endless, exhausting labor. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a quiet confirmation that greed always collects its heavy toll in the end. With the criminal trials concluded and my forged debt completely wiped clean by the courts, I found myself walking through the empty halls of my home one final time. The house had been my absolute sanctuary for decades. It was the place where I had built a life with my beautiful wife, where I had invested my blood, sweat, and tears. But the walls now felt irreparably tainted by the dark, toxic lies that had been whispered within them. The shadow of the massive 10-foot wooden fence still haunted the backyard. I could no longer find any peace there. I hired a real estate agent and sold the property to a lovely young couple who wanted to start a family of their own. I sincerely hoped they would fill the space with genuine love and honest laughter, completely erasing the dark history my son had left behind. The sale of the house, combined with the substantial funds recovered by the federal authorities, left me with a significant financial legacy. But I no longer cared about accumulating wealth or maintaining a large estate. My perspective on what truly mattered in this life had shifted profoundly. I worked closely with Thomas Keller to establish a massive ironclad college trust fund for young Leo. I wanted to make absolutely certain that Sarah's beautiful boy would never have to worry about his future, that he would have every single opportunity his brave mother had desperately wanted to give him. It was the only way I knew how to honor the incredible sacrifice she had made to expose the dangerous monster living right next door, giving her own life to successfully protect mine. My own life needed a fresh start, far away from the cold winters and the painful memories of Ohio. I packed my remaining belongings, bought a comfortable truck, and finally took that trip I had lied about all those months ago. I drove straight down the coast and bought a small, peaceful cottage in sunny Florida, right on the edge of the sparkling blue water. The salty ocean breeze rolling off the clear water is remarkably healing for my soul. Every morning I sit outside with a hot cup of coffee watching the peaceful sunrise. It beautifully clears the mind and wonderfully soothes the tired, aching joints of an old building inspector who has finally found peace. I am not alone down here. Thomas Keller arranged for Leo's legal guardians to bring him down to visit me during his school holidays. Right now I am sitting on the edge of a wooden pier, the warm Florida sun beating down on my shoulders, listening to the gentle lapping of the waves against the pilings. Leo is sitting right beside me holding a fishing rod with intense, joyful concentration. He just caught his very first snapper, and his bright, ringing laughter echoes across the quiet bay. I look at this sweet, innocent boy, and my heart feels incredibly full. I lost a son who carried my own blood, a man who chose darkness and greed over love and decency. But in the devastating wreckage of that loss, I found something remarkably pure. I realized that blood does not automatically make a family. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and honest love. I am proud to be a grandfather figure to this brave boy. We saved each other. Family is built on respect, not blood. If this story moved you, please leave a super thanks. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done? See you in the next life story.